Hello, and wanting to wish everyone a happy new year and welcoming you to the first meeting in 2023 of the Community Development and Urban Planning Committee. I am Council Member at Large Maria Cabrera, the chair of the committee, and at this time I would like to start with the committee members, please introducing themselves, starting on my right-hand side.
Good evening. I'm Councilwoman Brigida Fields, representing the 5th District.
Trippy Congo, Council President.
Councilmember Shanae Darby, representing the 2nd District.
Yolanda McCoy, 6th District.
The council members that are on via Zoom, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Nathan Field, 8th District. James Spittle, at large.
Thank you. We have a unanimous attendance this evening by our council members, and we're going to start with our first agenda item. We're going a little bit out of order if you are looking at an agenda. We're going to start with ordinance 22-046, an ordinance to amend Chapter 36 of the City Code Regulation, the aftermarket sale and purchase and repair of automobile catalytic converters. This is sponsored by Councilmember Oliver. However, this evening, we're going to have Councilmember Yolanda McCoy speak to this legislation. You may proceed, Councilmember McCoy.
Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to read the synopsis of this piece of legislation. This ordinance prohibits the sale, purchase, repair, or installation of an aftermarket catalytic converter without proper documentation. It is as required by lawful means. So basically, if someone's out here stealing catalytic converters, we want to make certain that they are unable to use those parts to repair another car or anything like that. Every catalytic converter that is going to be used will be used and have documentation stating that has been purchased properly before the installation into another car. And we are trying to do this to deter the theft of catalytic converters.
Thank you. Are there any council members that may have questions about this legislation? Yes, Councilmember Darby.
Yes, Councilmember McCoy, are you able to explain how this works in theory or process of holding someone accountable? If my Cadillac converter is I'm really curious. If my Cadillac converter, someone steals it today, how would someone be held accountable? If I support the legislation and work, but how is it implemented and enforced?
That's actually a really good question. I had the same question. So basically, when it comes to enforcement of anyone who steals the catalytic converter, that is actually up to Wilmington Police Department. But when it comes to the sale or the repair of a catalytic converter, that will be L&I. Businesses fall underneath L&I, and they are to make certain that all of these businesses are aware that they cannot be using older or whatever, aftermarket value catalytic converters to repair anyone else's car. So any catalytic converter that goes into a car has to have proper documentation. That way we know that it has not been stolen. So L&I does the enforcement for when it comes to the theft. Wilmington Police Department does enforcement when it comes to the theft, but L&I needs to do enforcement when it comes to the businesses, the repair or the sale of catalytic converters.
Okay.
President Congo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. What about junkyards? Are they in this equation at all?
No, I actually have to state I did not get that far into the legislation or the ordinance rather, but I would have to assume that if we're junking cars, don't they get titles?
I think, Madam Chair,
Yes, you may proceed.
I think that sometimes when people do steal catalytic converters, they take them to junkyards and get the quick cash. So I guess that was my question.
So
how could we prevent that?
May I answer, Madam Chair? May I respond?
Yes, you may.
Okay, thank you. So actually, as I stated in this, the synopsis, it prohibits the sale, purchase, repair, or installation. So that means that you cannot go to the junkyard and say, oh, I got a bunch of catalytic converters, here, give me the market value, whatever, of this metal. You cannot sell it without documentation. You cannot make the purchase without documentation. You cannot repair or install without documentation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
May I follow up?
Yes, Councilmember Darby?
Yes, no, I'm definitely in support of the legislation. I still don't see like if I go buy a Cadillac converter, like how are you gonna know? You know, like the implementing of, like I'm in support. I don't want, because I know a few people this has happened to, and there's like Cadillac converter boys, and they just over here just taking Cadillac converters throughout the city, like a whole little gang. But outside of that, I'm just concerned, like this is good, it's gonna look good, but is it really gonna like help with the aftermarket sale? That's my only thing, but yeah.
I understand.
Councilmember Spadola?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have two questions. One, do we know how many auto shops in Wilmington were working on stolen catalytic converters in the first place? And two, did we get any feedback from them about it looks like, I'm just looking at they need to keep records for 3 years on the catalytic converter sales. Did we get any feedback from them about this?
Is anyone able to answer that question? Councilman, okay, go ahead. Councilwoman McCoy, she's going to.
No, I actually unable to answer that question. This information, I'm basically presenting it as is, just to make certain that I look out for a colleague. But when it comes to the amount of repair shops, I'm like, that is definitely a good question. I think that is something that we probably could get that information from L&I when it comes to our businesses. But there are still a lot of businesses that are kind of under the radar that we may not know who's actually using these parts in order to repair someone's stolen catalytic converter. They may be putting it back in the car that just got stolen from. So we just want to make certain that those who are that we make certain that everyone is aware so that we can try to deter the theft of them.
Councilman Spadola, you may.
Sure. Can I have a follow-up?
Yes, you can follow up.
Thanks. No, I'm just, I mean, if I had legislation and I wasn't able to make the meeting, I would just not present it. So I feel for Council Member McCoy, who's doing a stellar job presenting. Why wouldn't Xanthia just hold this until she was present so we could answer these questions and have a more thorough discussion? Because I feel like we're kind of limited right now.
Councilman Spadola,
And I guess that's a rhetorical question, unless
yeah.
somebody
Did
has
you have
an
a
answer.
second question? You said you had two questions.
Could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Do you have a second question?
No, I'm just wondering, why wouldn't Council Member Oliver hold this so we could have a more thorough discussion, as opposed to zinging questions at Council Member McCoy that she understandably might not have the answers to, as she is not a sponsor or a co-sponsor of this legislation.
I understand, but I don't believe anybody here is prepared to answer that. However, looking at the legislation, really what we're doing, we understand we may not be able to enforce or prevent, but what we're doing is we're being consistent with other jurisdictions and the National Institute and Crime Bureau, what they have put into place, that this has contributed to a rise in crime. So what we're trying to do is to follow suit with what Governor John Carney signed with House Bill 296 into law, which modified the law with the state to require every scrap metal processor to create and record and provide information regarding the origin of that scrap metal acquired from catalytic converters. So really, it's about holding these shops accountable. And will they do it? We don't know. We don't know if we can enforce that. But what we're saying is that if they are getting the scrap metal, they have to have a record of 3 years of where that metal came from. That way, as police are conducting their investigations and they go to these shops, they can see the origin of where it came from. Will they all follow the law? We know people break the law all the time. But I believe it is good legislation because it's holding accountability, and it's going to make it harder for thieves to pawn and to sell the scrap metal by making sure that we have documentation. But with any law, all things are imperfect. Are there any other questions from my council members? Not hearing any, can I get a motion to vote this out of committee?
So moved.
Second.
It has been properly moved and second, and can I get a vote? All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, no one's opposed. This will be presented before City Council in the February meeting. And now we're going to, thank you, council members. Now we're going to proceed, we're going to put, the next item on the agenda is going to be a resolution authorizing the mayor to file a substantial amendment to the federal fiscal year 2021, city fiscal year 2022 annual action plan to outline the proposed use of supplemental home ARP funds. I am the sponsor of this legislation, and basically what we are doing is we're applying as an entitlement community to the Home Investment Partnership Program, which is called the HOME Program. And we adopted this resolution on May 20th of 2021, which approved the annual action plan for federal fiscal year 2021. And the plan is authorizing the mayor to submit the plan to the United States Housing and Urban Development Department, which is, we know is HUD. Now, HUD has advised the city that we are eligible to receive supplemental funding through the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, with respect to the plan in the amount of $2,107,727 to be distributed to the city pursuant to the HOME program to benefit qualifying individuals and families who are homeless and at risk of homelessness or in other vulnerable populations, the HOME ARP allocation. So with this amendment to the plan, we're able to apply for this funding, and we're authorizing the city to go forward with that. Do we have any questions from council members? Councilmember Darby.
Yes, I had specific questions. Do we have, maybe I missed it, but like a more thorough plan on exactly what, I know they broke it down in the budget, but what does it mean actually when they said development of affordable renting housing? Is there like a detailed plan yet on exactly what that looks like or where that money is going to yet?
Well, looking at this, I don't have the details,
Okay.
but they have to meet the HUD requirements. So in order for that money to be used, it's got to meet the HUD requirements. It has to be affordable per the federal guidelines. And by developing these properties, that means that those folks, especially people who are experiencing homelessness, can have affordable living arrangements. And it is something that was already approved by City Council and we're working on. However, this is allowing us to get additional funding that we qualify for.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions from council members? Not hearing any, can I get a motion to move this to the City Council?
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Councilmember Fields just reminded me, are there any questions from the public in reference to this legislation? And I apologize for not asking for public comment from the previous legislation. Is there anybody online? No. Any of my council members online that might have any questions about this? Okay. So at this point, can I get a motion to move this to the City Council meeting in February?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Cry with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, it has been properly moved and second, and this will be presented before council in our February meeting. All right, our third piece of legislation is an ordinance to rezone 14 parcels of land within the area generally bounded by the Maryland Avenue, the Amtrak Railroad Corridor, I-95, and Lower Elm Street from a zoning classification of M1 light manufacturing to a zoning classification of C2 secondary business center. The sponsor of this legislation is Councilmember Harley. She is not currently here at this meeting. Is there anyone that wants to speak to this? Otherwise, in that, I will address it. Okay? So basically, what this does is that we are changing the classification and the zoning of that property. So instead of having the light manufacturing, because we've had factories in that area, now we can have secondary businesses, which allows for smaller businesses to be located in that parcel. Are there any questions from my council members? Are there any questions from the public? Not hearing any, can I get a motion to move ordinance 22-050 to our city council meeting?
So moved.
Second.
It has been properly moved in second. All in favor, reply with aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay. We are moving very quickly here. Thank you, council members. And now our last item on the agenda, as we have ordinance 22-037 will be held.
Madam Chair,
Yes. Yes,
I'm
ma'am?
sorry. Yes, it's Marshall. I just wasn't for sure. I knew that Gwen was on for planning. I wasn't for sure if she had comments to make, but you already moved the ordinance. I thought she was supposed to present on it, but I
Oh.
just wanted to mention that for the record.
Oh, can she still, oh, it's been properly moved in second, she said. Well, if we moved it out, nobody had any questions, I guess we're good. All right, thank you. All right, moving along, we were going to item number 4. Yes? I'm sorry. Okay.
And
Item number 4, an ordinance to amend Chapter 4 of the City Code to impose civil fines on owners of vacant properties. And this ordinance is being sponsored by myself, and I believe we have other council members that have asked to be a sponsor. So basically, what this ordinance is doing, it already exists in a criminal fashion, meaning that if a property is vacant for an extended amount of time, usually 3 years or more, that the city can start to take action on acquiring that property, meaning that the property owner will not live in it, will not fix it, will not rent it, will not sell it, will not allow the city to buy it from them. So after all efforts have been exhausted to try to get the property repurposed, the city then proceeds to take the property to sheriff's sale. And the criminal process means that it has to go through the court system. The civil process takes it out of the courts and allows the city to obtain the property in a shorter period of time, meaning that the property can be repurposed much quicker, and you can get rid of that vacant eyesore out of your block, and we're able to develop it without the extended time period that it takes to go through the criminal process. I do have Rose here to phone from the law department. And Rose, if I could ask you to come up and you could speak further to the legislation. I don't want there to be any confusion. This is not part of any other legislation. This stands alone for the vacant properties and only for vacant properties that all efforts have been exhausted to try to work with the owners. And in some cases, the properties are abandoned and there is no owner. We also have our commissioner now, Mr. Starkey, don't sit down, just come right forward, because you may have to speak on this too. And it's not licensed and inspection. Tell me the name of your new division again, I forgot.
Department of Land Use and Planning.
Land use and planning, there we go. So Commissioner Starkey is no stranger to these issues, and I'm going to have both Rose and Commissioner Starkey tell us a little bit about this legislation and what that change from criminal to civil means. Who would like to start?
Good evening. Good evening, members of council. Rose Tassoni DiMardo from the Law Department. Basically, what the ordinance does is it amends certain provisions in Chapter 4 to change the enforcement as it relates only to vacant properties from what is currently now criminal to civil. Those changes, in large part, where we're dealing with the actual penalty provision and the violation notice provisions in the service, they mirror the changes that were enacted by council as it relates to the rental properties when we changed rentals from criminal to civil enforcement. So the language is pretty much the same. There's a couple other edits to the chapter where we deleted specific provisions that I should say, provisions within specific sections that referenced a criminal process for the vacant so that it's consistent. But the synopsis basically takes you through the exact changes. So it removes imprisonment as a potential penalty in criminal enforcement proceedings, which that is something that is in addition to changing it from civil to criminal. So for all proceedings, it removes even the proceedings that remain criminal, it removes the penalty of imprisonment. We did that in Chapter 34 when we amended the code as it relates to rental properties. It provides that fines may be imposed for each week's failure to correct violations rather than what is currently a daily fine. It sets forth requirements for the content and service of violation notices. It extends the time period in which to appeal a violation notice from 10 days to 20 calendar days. And it provides that the appeal fee shall be refunded if the appeal is successful. So those provisions are amending both the part of Chapter 4 that remains criminal and applies to the part of Chapter 4 dealing with vacant properties that we are now changing to civil.
Thank you. And that was good to see that we are being lenient to some extent by removing some of the harsher penalties that are involved with the criminal part of this. Are there any questions from our council members to Rose? And I don't know if Commissioner Starkey, if there's anything more that you wanted to add?
No, not anything to add, just, Rose kind of emulated what was going to go on. It's mirroring exactly what happened before. And I think I sent you a couple of pictures so that you can see some of the examples that we're dealing with. We're dealing with about 3 properties in the last week where the floors have collapsed in. The roof has collapsed, the first floor has collapsed to the second floor to the first floor. So those are some examples that we have to deal with on a daily basis. For some reason, we've had a rash in the last 3 days. Lancaster Avenue, West Street, and there's another one on Franklin Street. All 3 of those are in pretty bad shape, and they're all vacant properties. So this will help expedite the enforcement side of it so that we can get some hopefully swift action. If not, then we may have to resort to demolition.
Let's start with Councilmember McCoy, and then we'll proceed with Councilmember Darby.
Thank you. So, Madam Chair, my question is about the 3-year time frame. I do understand, I guess, when it comes to vacant, that we always making certain that people are registering their vacant properties and that they are paying if they are staying vacant. But 3 years, if it is vacant, 3 years may not be enough time that it actually became blighted. So I'm just trying to figure out how are we differentiating a 3-year vacant property to a blighted property that needs to be taken over by the city.
Taken over by the city?
Well, I'm sorry, but that the city needs to actually begin a process to take this property so that it does not become a health hazard to others in the area.
Rose, you may want to speak to that one.
Well, I think Councilmember Cabrera mentioned that, but that's not really in the ordinance, and I'm not,
Well, let me ask this. What is the time frame that these properties have to remain vacant before we would take civil action on them? Is it because of when the fines get to a certain amount?
I think we're talking about 2 different things. I think what you may be speaking to, Councilwoman Cabrera, is perhaps an internal process as it relates to sheriff sales. And as everyone knows, you can't take a property to sheriff sale unless there is debt that is owed on the property. Okay? There, as far as I'm aware, and certainly not in Chapter 4 in these amendments, does it reference anything about 3 years. So that may be an internal process that we're talking about.
These are just to be dealing with violations in the condition of the property, which could eventually, contribute to, some fines and things of that nature. But There's no 3 years
No,
that
so.
I'm aware of.
So like everything else in the code and this entire process, you have a vacant property, be it blighted or not blighted, it's a vacant property. There are certain minimum requirements that the code imposes in terms of the maintenance of your property. And when that requirement is violated, when it's not maintained in the way it should be maintained, L&I is going to come out and issue a violation notice, just like vacant properties are treated the same as everybody else. So you get a violation notice. You're told what the violation is. You're told the repair that has to be made. You're given a time frame in which to make those repairs. If you make the repairs, perfect. You're good. Nothing happens, right? If you don't make the repairs, then a fine is imposed. If you pay your fine, that is not a debt on the property, right? It's done. If you pay your fine but you don't make the repair, you're going to continue to get fined. So it's just like everything else. You're being given an opportunity to make your repairs. The idea too, in terms of changing this to civil, from criminal to civil, as Councilwoman Cabrera said, is it does eliminate the court process. So it does. Bless you.
Thank you.
It does make the process.
Swiffer.
Yes, quicker. So you're not dealing with the continuances and things like that, the scheduling, and you're given your violation notice, you're given your opportunity to appeal, and the same in here. If you need extra time to make the repair, you're given that opportunity too. But if you don't ultimately do it, then we can impose a fine.
And what typically happens is, we get the calls from the neighbors that are living next door, whether they're getting water damage, mold, or what have you. That's a result of some of these properties being, open. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 or 3 of them that we're dealing with right now where the roof's gone, so all the water is just pouring into the property. If you live next door to that, you're experiencing those damages. And that's the more important thing, so we can expedite this enforcement side so that we can get to the root of the problem, hopefully. And if not, then we'll deal with it further on the other side.
Yeah, my apologies. I misspoke when I threw the 3 years in there. I was thinking of something else.
Okay.
So that's my fault, and I'm sorry if that created any confusion among my council members or the public. We have Councilmember Darby. Councilwoman McCoy, have your questions been answered? I don't want to move on if you have any others.
Yes, it did. It does make more sense now because I just wasn't able to differentiate how could something who actually still looks nice but yet is vacant be a person be penalized.
I will share some of the pictures of some of the properties we're dealing with.
Okay, yeah.
You would be shocked.
But yeah, those are basically not watertight, and they are basically
True.
a hazard to the houses around it. We are literally a city, pretty much, of row homes.
Right, absolutely.
I'm sure the city's priority are always going to be the ones that are in blight, not the ones that are in good standing and they're being taken care of.
Correct.
We have Councilmember Darby and then Councilmember Spadola with questions.
Yes, I have a few questions and a comment. One of my questions was about, so I know this is just for vacant buildings who have violations, right? Who are like those troubled vacant buildings and who are not fixing those repairs. However, at what point, I know there's the extreme ones where like the second floor is falling into take care of those, right? Let's do our due process. But at what point at a vacant property, because I know to go to sheriff's sale, there isn't a limit or a set amount to take someone to sheriff's sale. So they can be behind on $100 or $1,000 or $10,000 in theory because there's not a set number on when you can take someone to sheriff's sale. I just wanted to make sure that I was correct on that there isn't a number to when you can take someone to sheriff's sale for past debt.
That I'm not aware of that, but I'm also not here to answer the questions related to sheriff's sale.
Yeah, no, it's connected to to my concerns about the legislation, so that's why I'm asking it. So it's not like it's a totally different topic or that. So that would kind of help me because I don't want vacant property owners to be taken advantage of, or let's say just saying, let's say the city wanted a particular block for some reason, for development, and then to use this tool to say, oh, you owe $100, you owe $200, and then take advantage of vacant property owners on that block where they may have a few fines or fees for high grass or something, you know, whatever it may be, but not their second floor falling into the first floor. It's not that extreme, right? So that was why I asked that question. It wasn't disconnected from what I'm saying. So for me, I would like to have that confirmed. I'm in support of the legislation, but I also think that we need to do more in regards to putting up safe barriers so that things like that don't happen. And then we also have existing laws already that deals with vacant properties that we need to actually start doing some like enforcement on those things. So that was my initial question, and I see that we cannot answer it here. But if you can kind of explain to someone what happens to vacant buildings who are in violation. So I know you said they go through sheriff's sale, but what happens, like what's the process like for when you're taking a vacant property?
So not all vacant buildings go through a sheriff's sale process.
Okay.
So Councilwoman Darby, are you asking what's the process here in terms of the Chapter 4 enforcement?
Yeah,
or-
and this enforcement. So like if I'm in violation, my house, my floor fell through, I didn't pay the fees and fines, what happens? Like, what happens to that house? I know the city is gonna take it over, but what happens? What does the city do?
City doesn't necessarily take it over. I mean, you continue to issue fines. You can continue to issue fines. Not necessarily the city's going to take it over. I mean, the city would have to take it to sheriff's sale in order to take it over. But, I mean, from an enforcement standpoint, you continue to issue fines. You can issue fines every week, similar to what we did for rental properties.
So, and two, I'll add to it. So, number one, the city doesn't take every vacant property, and even properties that are in bad condition. I mean, so we're not out there taking every vacant property out there. But in terms of the sheriff's sale process, to be clear, when the city sends a property to sheriff's sale, right, that's to collect on the debt. So it's a public sale. So anybody can bid on that property. If the property's in really bad shape, as a lot of them are, and they have very little value, then a lot of times, yes, so that it may fall back on the city or, you know, whoever. But it's not that when the city sends it to sheriff's sale that the city automatically gets that property.
Okay.
So it's a public bid.
And it can go to the land bank, it can go to the sheriff's sale, it can just keep getting
It
fined.
goes to whoever is the highest, I guess, the highest bidder.
Right. And the really bad ones, most times they're demolished because they're so bad that
Okay.
they're not even worth saving. I mean, the one I'm talking about on West Street, 2700 block of West Street, the entire roof is off. The roof's on the second floor, which fell into the first floor. So, I mean, it's so bad, it's so dangerous. As a matter of fact, we're meeting a structural engineer out there tomorrow just to declare it as an emergency demolition. That's how bad it is.
And sometimes with these really bad properties, the reason why they've gotten to that point, a number of them, there's issues with like heirs and things, like the title is
caught up,
difficult
right.
to, you know, and so it's not easy for the property owners to really sell the property, or nobody's taken responsibility because you've got 20 people over time as one person dies and their heirs, and sometimes sheriff's sale is a good way to clean up that title. If money is owed to the city, we'll put it up for sale. It's where we've tried through the more traditional approach, code enforcement, issuing tickets and things like that to get the owners to comply. If that fails, then you can take it to sheriff's sale, and if it is sold, that's also a way to kind of clean up the title.
And unfortunately, a lot of times when we're dealing with some of these properties, the address is the address of the property, so you really can't find some people in some cases, unfortunately. And in this case on the West Street property that I was referring to, the person's address, that's where it's addressed to the property, a vacant property. You know, obviously they're not living at the vacant property, so it's difficult sometimes to track them down. So obviously they neglected the property and just walked away from it. But I'll share some pictures with you I'll send you some.
No,
emails.
I believe you guys. I just want people to understand what can potentially happen with vacant properties. They could be demoed. They could go to sheriff's sale. A public buyer can buy them. The city can keep it, and then I don't know what the city does with them. I don't know if they like develop them, turn them into affordable housing. I don't know. They give them to the land bank. So I wanted people to understand what happens to vacant properties afterwards when they go through this process, but the problematic ones. So yes, thank you.
Councilman Spadola, before I turn to you, piggyback on what Councilman Darby said. Well, first, I know the city is not in the business of development, so we're not going, that's not what we do. So when the land bank was formed, basically whatever we're stuck with to some extent, because if nobody buys it, then we have the property. Now, with the land bank, there might be some properties that we say, okay, you know, the city would like to have that property, we'll bid on it. It goes to the land bank, it gets repurposed, it gets sold, or it gets rented, and it has to adhere to all the HUD guidelines. Thus, it will be affordable homeownership or affordable rental. But I want to go back to the fines. So if a property gets fined, is there a limit? For example, they have a $100 fine. Does the city take a property to sheriff's sale on a $100 fine, or does it have to accumulate to a certain amount without that fine being paid before it goes to sheriff's sale? That's where I think we should be able to answer that, because that's the clarity, and I understand exactly where Councilwoman Darby's coming from. You're not just going to take people to sheriff's sale over $100, and most people would be able to pay $100. You're not going to lose an asset over $100, but let's say if that was a scenario.
It'll cost the city a lot more than $100 to even take it to sheriff's sale, so most likely it won't go to sheriff's sale for $100. I know that's an extreme example, but obviously it's got to get to a limit in order for it to qualify for a sheriff's sale. What that limit is, finance, would have to answer that question.
Basically, it's someone who just has refused to pay any of the fines or do any of the work. It's not, you just can't go in and take a home, even if it's vacant, unless it's just gotten to that point. So I'm sorry, Councilman Spadola, you're next. And then President Congo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So reading this legislation, if I were to distill it down to, a very simple 2 or 3 sentences, it's essentially, this allows the city to proceed civilly, not criminally, with specifically vacant properties, in the sense that it doesn't, so if somebody lives in a house and they're getting tickets for, high grass, chip paint and all that, they keep getting them, but they're not gonna, this section would never apply because it's not vacant. But if that house were vacant, it can then, these other penalties kick in because it's specifically a vacant. Is that correct?
Councilman Spadola, so all it does is it changes the current criminal enforcement to civil enforcement. So instead of L&I issuing a criminal summons to the vacant property owner for failing to comply with their violation notice, the city is just going to issue that person a civil fine.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
So it's not, it's simple, so it does. And we basically have a different process for how we deal with occupied properties versus rental, versus vacant. And this, so I'm on one hand, I'm trying to understand that nuance in and of itself, and then I'm trying to understand the process of taking it out from criminal to civil. So I just wanted to make sure my interpretation is correct, in the sense that I get that it's going from criminal to civil with this legislation. But my first point is that civil or criminal, this specific section only applies to vacants. And essentially, if you have a vacant and you're not taking care of your other violations, then this section kicks in.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's
Correct. The penalty section that's being added to this only kicks in if it's a vacant property.
Yeah,
And there's no time for it. It could be vacant for.
If I remember my code correctly, Chapter 4 deems a property to be vacant if it is unoccupied for 45 consecutive days.
45.
That's how. I
Okay,
like it.
thank you.
Right.
And President Conco, and then Council.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just need some clarity. Is this dealing with vacant and blighted properties, or just vacant? Just vacant.
Just vacant
So
property.
if a property owner has a house and they're keeping up with it, lawns cut, no violations, but it's vacant, that's where these fines will be imposed because it's vacant?
No,
It has to have a violation in order to get a fine.
correct.
Okay, not just being vacant.
No, just
Okay, I didn't read it.
dealing with the violations.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. It brings clarity because we don't want people to think that you're just getting fines because it's vacant. It's because the upkeep of the property and the property becomes what? A nuisance because it starts falling apart because it's not being upkept. And going back to the former question with Councilman Spadola, we already in our housing code, we changed that from criminal to civil, and that's for occupied properties and not owner occupied, but only for rentals.
For rentals.
Because that was taken out of the legislation. So that would be, if you have a blighted property and the landlord just refuses to fix it, then yes, it will go through the civil process because that legislation was enacted last year. This is completely separate and only for vacant properties that have accumulated violations. And Councilmember McCoy, you're up next.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to state, 2019, we actually passed an ordinance that dealt with vacant properties. And it did give the city actually the ability to put several penalties through. Now, the thing is that this came through out of the Healthy Community Subcommittee, and Chapter 4 was such a beast that we could not deal with that we ended up putting it in Chapter 13. So we have an ordinance actually already on file that deals with vacant properties and making certain that we were dealing with those that have an issue of health and the blighted issue. We understood that the city needs to take care of these eyesores, that we could not have anything that was literally falling apart. Like I said, we are basically a city of row homes, so we cannot allow these things to deteriorate and make other people's homes unstable. But I'm just saying we already put one together in 2019, and I just didn't know whether or not, is it because we put it in Chapter 13 it was overlooked, or is it because we needed to do something in Chapter 4 in order to make this happen, because we already have this. I didn't know whether or not, I just finally got a chance to pull it up, and it basically states, hold up. City Council recognizes that, and it was voted through. City Council recognizes that blighted vacant properties are an eyesore and that they decrease the surrounding property values and pose a threat to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Whereas criminal penalties have not been sufficiently effective in deterring violations of the city code provisions related to blighted vacant properties, and whereas City Council believes the imposing civil penalties on property owners who fail to comply with Section 13-42 of the City Code will be more effective in deterring this unlawful conduct. And whereas City Council deems it necessary and proper to permit the Department of License and Inspection to issue citations and impose civil penalties upon property owners or responsible parties who fail to comply with these provisions. And whereas the City Council intends the unpaid amounts of the civil penalties for failing to comply with these city code provisions to give rise to a lien on the property in violation as permitted under Title 25, Section 2901 of the Delaware Code. And whereas City Council deems it necessary and proper to amend Chapter 13, Article 2 of the City Code to effectuate these changes. And then Section 1 is, Chapter 13 of the City Code hereby amended by adding Section 13-42 entitled Vacant Properties, which shall be the document attached hereto as Exhibit A, and shall constitute and codify as Section 13-42 of the City Code. Now, I'm like, it does kind of give more definition about what, vacant is and all of that. And so it's basically Section 1342. I just didn't know whether or not do we need to have another. Did this not do enough, or did not encompass enough in order to be able to enforce this? And that's the reason why we need Section 4 amended or whatever, or did we just kind of forget that it was there?
No.
No,
So-
I'm just asking.
No, we didn't forget it was
Okay.
there. So traditionally, violations on vacant properties as it relates to building maintenance and everything have been enforced through Chapter 4. Chapter 4 has a provision dealing with the responsibility of owners, and it's a long list of things that you're supposed to do to maintain that property. It also incorporates the international
Building
code. And so Chapter 4 is usually where LNI is looking to when it goes to enforce code provisions against the vacant properties. And so by amending Chapter 4 to flip criminal to civil, you've just expanded the types of violations now for which you can impose the civil fine.
And I think, Chapter 4 is more comprehensive in terms of what we can cite them for. And I think Chapter 13 was a little bit more vague, whereas we have more violations in which to cite you under in Chapter 4. So I think that more encompasses more of what they can do.
Yeah, I'm sorry, now follow?
Follow up.
Okay. Yeah, like I stated, Chapter 4 was definitely a beast, because once you touch one thing, you got to touch everything else. So I definitely understand that, and that's the reason why we had chose Chapter 13. But I do understand that we need to go to do civil in order to start addressing some of these things. So I just wanted to make certain that you were aware that we did attempt this in 2019.
I'm aware of it.
If I can ask real quickly, is there any conflict with having the redundancy with Chapter 4 and 13, or just 14 just gives it more teeth, but 13 is still there?
I think you can go under either one. Chapter 13, there are certain definitions and how it lays out the violations. And so I don't see that as a conflict between the two chapters. You can utilize whichever one you want.
In Chapter 4 is more geared towards buildings, so that's where our building codes are. Our building code codes are in Chapter 4, and also, the vacant property fees are in Chapter 4 as well. So,
Great, thank you. We have Councilman Spadola and then Councilmember Darby.
Thank you. Can you add me as a co-sponsor, please?
Yes, you may. I apologize. Councilmember Fields has a question, but Councilman Spadola, please add him as a co-sponsor.
It wasn't so much of a question, but it was more so of a comment. I understand this ordinance, and I don't know how it may affect other districts, but coming from a representative of the 5th District in Lower Hilltop and in West Center City, you just walk in the streets, and there are some vacant properties that are well kept, and they're fine. They're not destroying the neighborhoods. But we have right there on Conrad Street where we just had 2 buildings that were owned by the land bank that Jumpstart graduates they took. The roofs was actually falling in. The backyards were no good. The flooring was horrible, but they renovated these properties and they made them available for sustainable housing. However, we still have abandoned and vacant. We have vacant properties that are harmful to the community and those in that area to live in. So I think it is in our best interest to actually support this ordinance because it's going to be beneficial. If we're trying to beautify our districts and we're trying to beautify the city of Wilmington, we have to hold people accountable. And I think this is another way of holding those individuals accountable for those properties that are not just abandoned and vacant, but are causing harm to those who live in that district. And like my colleague said, we do live in a city of row homes. So if a roof is leaking on one of those abandoned homes, it's definitely going to go to the neighbor's house who's living there, who's taking care of their property, who's paying those property taxes, and who's trying to raise a family. But they can't because of those properties that they live next door to. So I just wanted to put that comment out there, and I am supportive of this legislation, and I believe I'm already a co-sponsor.
Thank you, Councilmember Fields. That is well said, and it brings the point home. Just in the Lower Hilltop area alone, the east side, and I just want to say that when I look at the stats of where the most crime and the shootings occur, they 95% of the time, I would say, occur within 100 to 300 feet of a vacant property. The more that the city can do to get a handle on these vacant properties and repurpose them, not only are we providing homes, affordable homes for people who need housing, because we have a housing shortage right now in our city as well as across America, but we are actually going to take a bite out of crime. We are going to see the crime numbers drop. Councilmember Darby.
Yes, no, thank you. And I thought you brought up a great point, Councilmember McCoy, about Chapter 13, because when I was talking about enforcing, I didn't want to go through them, but enforcing the existing laws, that was one of them. And I think we all support and are on board with that there's a vacant property issue in the city of Wilmington. So I don't think that's the issue. But I just want to make sure that they don't conflict, like having those two, that it makes sense. And I'm in full support of it if it doesn't, if there's no conflict between the two, or you might, benefit you more to use 13, benefit you more, like there's like some discrepancy. I don't want that to happen. So I'm glad that it's happening. In Chapter 4 also, if we're talking about enforcing existing laws, currently it says we can use income for vacant property registration program to rehab vacants. So we're saying that we use Chapter 4 for a lot of things, but a lot of things aren't even being enforced that exist, like already Chapter 13, which exists already, and there's other things I can list here from Chapter 4 that is not in existence that can help with the vacant property issue that we have that's just not happening or enforced. So I don't know if that's another presentation about existing laws in Chapter 4 that's not happening, but it's just not happening. And we already have, what this legislation does, we can already do, but if it's going to line up and match, I'm in support of it, so.
Thank you, Councilmember Darby. Are there any other council members, either here or online? Councilmember Fields, and then we'll open it up to the public.
Yes, here's one more question. So are we talking about the enforcement, or has the chapter changed at all, or we just, the only thing that we're changing in this ordinance is it going from,
Criminals to civil.
that's it,
That's it.
nothing else?
No.
The enforcement and all of that is the same from when it was in there before?
Correct.
So the only thing okay, so just, okay, I just wanted to make sure.
The changes to the chapter itself are listed in the synopsis.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Councilmember McCoy?
I just have one more comment. When it came to the sheriff's cell question, yeah, so there actually is nothing that triggers something going to sheriff's cell, and if that's what you mean by there's no amount, there is no amount that triggers it, but they normally do not go to sheriff's cell for anything under 10,000. That's what we've been told by finance on multiple occasions.
Okay.
But nothing actually, there's nothing that triggers it, like a flag or something that comes up that it needs to go.
Thank you, Councilmember McCoy. You are so well versed on this.
Yeah,
Look
this
at
was,
her,
yeah,
the
this,
little expert sitting right in front of us.
this
$107
beat us up in 107.
All right, at this point, not seeing any other questions from my council colleagues, we're open to comments or questions from the public. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, Council. Councilwoman Cabrera, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
I apologize, I didn't get a chance to call you.
And the committee, the whole committee. And my name's Christian Willauer. I'm a volunteer with the Homes Campaign, which is a housing network in Delaware that's focused on making sure that everybody has access to safe, decent, affordable housing. And so we just wanted to bring some comments on this legislation. And one of them is that Chapter 34, like, I know there was a lot of discussion we all had over a few years about changing criminal to civil in Chapter 34. So right now, Chapter 34 provides for civil penalties on rental properties. And a lot of the language is super similar to this, but then this new legislation is in Chapter 4, and that other legislation is in Chapter 34. So just for simplicity, it just might make sense to, like, say in Chapter 34, for vacant and rental properties, all these civil penalties apply. But that would just be a suggestion to make things simple. But the other thing is that Chapter 13, which is about health and safety issues, there's like Councilwoman McCoy was already saying, there's this legislation that gives the city the power to enforce civil penalties for when a vacant property is not kept clean, secure, and watertight. So we were talking before about, like, is this law going to apply to blighted properties, or is it going to apply to vacant properties that might just happen to be, like, unoccupied, but they're kept in good shape? And so that Chapter 13 law that's around vacant properties, it has, like, a laser focus on properties that are blighted, like they're not kept clean, they're not kept safe, they're not kept watertight. And it gives the city the chance to, like, impose these civil fines of $250 a week for properties that are not being kept, you know, like those properties that the commissioner was talking about that are not kept, you know, where the roof is falling in. Like, the city has the power right now to go out and give those guys civil penalties of $250 a week. And then all those civil penalties can add up. And then those civil penalties, if they don't take care of them, they can take the property to sheriff's sale for those civil penalties. So it's like a really great law that focuses LNI's attention on those blighted properties. So I guess one question I would just hope that you'll ask is, you know, what about that law? Has it been enforced? Has it gotten any results? You know, because the goal is to really focus on those properties that are undermining our neighborhoods. And they would all fall under that Chapter 13 law. And if you all, you know, it's just meant to, a lot of times we hear in the communities that maybe LNI is focusing on properties that have smaller problems where the bigger problems don't get the attention. So that Chapter 13 law would really focus LNI's attention with the civil fines on those properties that are not being kept clean, secure, and watertight, and really are undermining the neighborhoods. So we were just I would invite council to, you know, consider whether or not, take a look at the impact of that Chapter 13 law and see, are we getting any results? And just for this changes, I had a few more comments, which was, in addition to, you know, allowing for civil penalties for, like, any violation in a vacant property, not just the ones that are, like, big, like not kept clean, secure, and watertight. This would be like the chipping paint, you know. And just because we live in an old city, like, pretty much any house has code violations. So there's a lot of people, I mean, a lot of people say we want LNI to focus on the big problems, you know, and get resolution on the big problems. So in addition to making any code violation in a vacant property subject to civil fines, the law as proposed also eliminates some important things that we would just suggest that be taken out of the law, be revised. So it eliminates, like, one of the big powers one of the things that it eliminates is the city's ability to give warnings in Chapter 4. So what you want is, like, you want to get any property owner who is going to make a difference to make that difference, like, with the least amount of kind of friction, right? So if you eliminate warnings, that it just, why eliminate warnings? Why not give LNI the power to go to an owner and say, like, fix this, you know? And then, okay, they can come back the next time and say, like, you didn't fix it, now we're going to give you a fine, you know? So we would just say, keep warnings in there. There's no need to get rid of the ability of LNI to give warnings. Second, it also seems to weaken the city's power to clean and lean. So one of the powers of the city is if a property owner is not taking care of their property, the code gives LNI the ability to go out and, like, do it and then charge back the cost. And that's important because sometimes the owners aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we do need kind of the backstop of, like, somebody, maybe, you know, we can depend on the city to do some of that cleaning and leaning. So, you know, there's section 116.7 that this proposal would eliminate, which would, if a code enforcement officer, if a building is vacant and a code enforcement officer, you know, notices that it's unsecure and wants to board it, that's something that LNI does. And they can't contact the owner. Like, right now, the code enforcement officer can get a warrant to enter and make the necessary repairs. And this proposed law would eliminate that. We would say, keep it. Like, let's give the city all the tools they can have. Like, why take away tools? And then also, it eliminates a couple things I was just curious about, maybe needs more research. The reimbursement of the city for costs incurred for securing and boarding a property, or eliminates the reimbursement to the city for costs incurred for doing exterior improvements. So it seems wise to give the city the power to, like, recoup any costs that might be involved in the city taking responsibility for vacant properties where the owner has abandoned responsibility. So we just think that there's some things about this law that need more attention before moving forward. And we would just suggest that maybe that the council could ask for an evaluation of how well LNI, how much LNI has been using that Chapter 13, which gives the power to do these civil fines for properties that aren't kept clean, secure, and watertight. How many times has it been applied? Are they getting compliance out of it? Like, does it work? And maybe the same thing for the change from criminal to civil for rental properties. Like, that happened last year, I think, at this time, or maybe 2 years ago. Like, is it working? Like, is LNI, like, giving those fines to properties? Is those fines, like, getting properties into compliance? Some evaluation might help guide, like, policymaking.
Ms. Will, I know I'd let you go 4 minutes over because we don't have other people lined up, but I would like some of the points
Thank
that
you.
she made, or any of the points that she made, could they be addressed or answered by law or the commissioner?
If I can remember, well, I'll try to
Okay.
remember, but, so the reimbursement, of the city, so that section that I believe Ms. Willauer is referring to is 116.7, B3. Reason why that's taken out is because, it's reimbursement of the city at the time of sentencing. Well, if we're not going criminal, you're not, that section does not apply. So that's what I said at the very beginning, that some of these sections have specific provisions in there that relate solely to the criminal process. If there's not a criminal process in place, then that section makes no sense. But to Ms. Willauer's point, the city has the ability currently to seek reimbursement, and actually we can currently, at the time of sentencing, when we take this criminally, ask for reimbursement, but traditionally we don't. We bill the person. We send them an invoice, and they pay, and if they don't pay, it's a lien on the property. So we're not giving up anything there.
And we do have a property maintenance budget in the department, so we often do grass cutting, boarding, you name it, we've done it. So alley cleanups as well. And we bill the property owners. Sometimes we get paid, sometimes we don't. But if it does go to sheriff sale, those costs are associated with that property. So we do that often. I think the budget is $120,000 in property maintenance. We have a contractor. He goes out and provides those services, and we bill the owner for those services.
In terms of the issuance of warning, so the commissioner of LNI has the inherent authority to give you a warning. You don't need something in the code to tell you or to allow the commissioner to basically send somebody a letter, and they have done it in other situations where there is no provision in the code that allows for warnings, where they may hang a door knocker or leave some type of notice at properties indicating that this is an issue. Please fix it. If you don't fix it, then we would have to start the the process. So LNI is not losing anything. What it does is, though, in keeping it can be confusing in terms of this more informal warning versus the actual violation notice that triggers your due process, whereby you're being formally told the property's in violation, this is the code section, here are your appeal rights. So in removing that language, LNI still has the authority, if they want to, which they have done in the past, to give somebody a warning without actually first issuing the violation notice.
But keep in mind, you're dealing with vacant properties. Most times they're not responsive anyway. But again, the violation notice is a sense of a warning as well. So if you need additional time, you can ask for additional time. We're not opposed to asking for additional time. The object is to get your attention that there's a problem. And most vacant property owners don't respond to the issue. That's why they're vacant. As I mentioned, they deteriorate. So again, the violation notice is a sensible warning. You get the violation notice, you know you have an issue. If you have an issue, you want additional time, you ask for additional time. So,
If before I lose this one thought,
Yeah.
the other one was clean and lean. Now I'm not 100% sure
And then
what
13, code 13, I'd like that answered as well.
well, I'm not able to answer the what's going on under 13 in terms of enforcement and things like that. But clean and lean, I'm not sure what Ms. Willauer was looking at in terms of where the city would no longer have the ability to do that. We certainly do. There's a section in Chapter 4, in fact, that deals with improvements to vacant properties, where and it tracks a state code section where the city can go in and make certain repairs to a vacant property, and that amount, again, is billed to the owner, and that becomes a lien on the property. So there is nothing in this section that is taking away the city's authority to take action, to abate certain problems with the property, and then impose those costs on the owner.
And in terms of, she was saying, instead of, we talked about this already, the chapter 4 is the stronger versus chapter 13, but the question that Ms. Willauer, that I heard her ask was, have we been enforcing chapter 13? Have we been collecting fines through that process?
well, I can't answer the question because I'm not in, I'm in land use now, but Chapter 13 was more vague and it was a little bit more difficult to impose it. That's why Chapter 4 is a much better solution to the problem, because that's where the building is comprehensive for all buildings, just not housing. It's, you know, commercial, residential, industrial, or what have you. So it's more comprehensive. It gives us more tools in order to cite the violations on there.
Okay. And to answer Ms. Willauer's question in terms of what we passed, it'll be 2 years this February in terms of Chapter 34 of the Housing Code. Councilman Field has brought this up and wanted to get a report from LNI to see how we've been doing with that. I do want to remind folks that that was implemented in July 1st of last year. So we haven't even had a year of that being on record, but I am going to ask for an upcoming meeting to answer the questions that Councilman Field has and that were brought up today by Ms. Willauer as to how that has affected the city. Are we able to get more compliance from the landlords in terms of correcting the problems in those properties? Are the tenants now, getting the services they should from their landlords for the money that they're paying? And see if we have some data and some numbers that we can present in a future meeting, maybe perhaps in March or around that time, we can get an update on that. And with that, Councilmember Darby, I saw your hand up.
I actually found it, Councilmember Cabrera, but I was looking for the part in here about just making sure that they can extend the time period, if that was in the legislation, but I see it's in A4 under 114.4.2, that they are able upon request to ask for extended time if need be to get any repairs done, and then they're able to, I guess, submit an appeal if they don't agree with what you guys are saying.
Absolutely.
So
I mean, the ultimate goal is to get compliance. Everybody wins if we get compliance. I mean, we're not in the business of just trying to give you a fine. We want compliance, and if we get compliance, the neighbors have compliance, and we have compliance as well. We're not in the business of just going out and just citing people. We get complaints and we deal with complaints, and as a result of the complaints, we have this tool in order to get compliance, and that's all we want.
Ms. Willauer indicated, and it goes along to what Councilmember Darby just mentioned, that the amendments here are very similar to the amendments that we made in Chapter 34. In fact, I would tell you that when it comes to notice of violations and the violation penalty provisions themselves, they're identical, and that was intentional. Because the language was, as everyone knows, when we were talking about it in Chapter 34, there was a lot of discussion over the language. We got very detailed and specific until everybody was comfortable with it. And so there is no reason why we wouldn't then just put that language in Chapter 4 and apply that to vacants. So it would address the same issues that were brought forward when we dealt with the rental properties, and we're just putting it right in Chapter 4.
And if I could also answer that, when Chapter 34 was amended, it does not apply to property owners, because that was left out. And does not apply to commercial, which is why we can't just add vacants as a subline or subcategory to Chapter 34, because Chapter 34 is not dealing with vacants, and with this particular legislation is dealing with rental properties specifically. So we can't just add it. This is different, and this is more, and it's more inclusive of these properties, as said, with that isn't even included with Chapter 13. That's why we have to go with Chapter 4,
In
not
fact-
34 or 13. And Councilmember, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, in fact, if council recalls, when we were dealing with the rental properties, there was a rather large ordinance that some folks had issue with. That ordinance actually did put the provisions dealing with vacants from 4 into 34. And folks found that to be confusing. And so we kept things where they are. 34 is the housing code and deals with owner-occupied and rental properties. Chapter 4 is the building code. It deals with commercial properties and vacant properties. And so rather than move provisions, substantive requirements that apply to vacants from Chapter 4 to 34, we just kept everything in 4 and did the same thing in terms of simply amending the penalty provisions to make clear that when L&I is issuing a violation notice for a vacant property, it's civil. It's a civil enforcement scheme. It's not criminal.
Yep. Thank you for bringing that up. So basically, what we're saying is that the concerns of Section 107 were heard. Instead of it being a package, which would have maybe kept it simpler, having everything under one, people were not comfortable with that. So we're here looking at each individual section of what was called the blight bill. So this was one of those things that were being addressed with that particular bill, but we're doing it this way instead of having everything inclusive, which maybe would have made it less confusing, but that's not how it was done. We're here now. We're having this thoughtful discussion. I thank my colleagues for their questions and the public, Ms. Christian Willauer. We have Councilmember Fields. Okay, Councilmember McCoy, you can go first, and then Councilmember Fields also wants to make a comment.
I have one comment. That would not have made things simpler. I was here for 107. That would not have made things simpler. I'm like, we've gotten where we are. Would have probably made things simpler if this came out in March rather than the 2-year span or something, because we would have still been fresh from what had happened initially or something. We would have still had it on our mind. So it took a little bit of joggling of the memory bank to say, oh, okay, yeah, I do remember this.
Thank you.
Hold on, I'm sorry, Rose, I really forgot my question. I had it on my mind. I think, for Chapter 4, going back to Chapter 4, if we wouldn't even be addressing civil fines, we wouldn't even be talking about Chapter 4 now, will we?
No, because
I'm just asking a question, because this is already an ordinance, right? So we're just
yes.
amending it. We're switching it from one to the other.
Correct,
So if we weren't even switching it, it wouldn't even be a concern or anybody bringing
Right.
this up, right?
In other words, the building requirements, right, the maintenance requirements applicable to vacant properties is not changing. Okay? We're not adding anything, we're not deleting anything as it relates to how an individual is supposed to maintain their property. What we're doing is changing the way we're enforcing if you fail to correct a violation that we cite you for. We're changing it from what is currently a criminal to a civil. That's it.
Thank you.
Which should hopefully expedite the enforcement, dealing with the issues expeditiously as opposed to waiting to the criminal side through the court system. Court system can be very lengthy, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Understood. Thank you so much. Appreciate your answers.
Well, at this point, not seeing any hands from my colleagues online or my colleagues here. The last comments I would like to make is that, you know, I see that we are making headway with our vacant property problems. We have development taking place on the east side. And the east side is one of the places where we see a lot of high numbers when it comes to shootings and crime. And the lower hilltop, as my council colleague here mentioned, and areas of West Center City, where I recently just moved from. I've lived there for 7 years, and I saw, and you go through, you know, my first session on council, when the shootings were happening, so many young people, first of all, it broke my heart. It put me through a lot of changes, and I just wanted to understand what was happening. So I started going to all the shooting sites, and I did do that my first term. Asked the police officers, they saw me, what are you doing here, they would say. And I saw the common denominator. And I'm not going to tell you that it happened in every shooting, because some happened indoors, some were isolated. But the majority of them did happen within 100 to 300 feet of a vacant property. The second denominator was that liquor store. Maybe less occurrence, but it was still pretty high. The third common denominator was that problem corner store. So it's not that the city is anti-businesses. We're trying to get a handle on the crime. If there's no one there to see, if no one cares about that block, if we, the city ourselves, are not enforcing and doing something about getting a handle on our neighborhoods and these vacant properties, and the poor people that are being held hostage in those blocks that have these vacants and these problems and these shootings, we're not doing our job. So I firmly believe that by stabilizing our neighborhoods, we're going to see a change, and that change is going to impact on so many levels. But the one thing that is within our control, where we really can get a handle on crime, is by stabilizing the neighborhoods. We can't fix the educational system that causes the things that are happening. We're not the state, we're not there, we don't have that power as council members. But there's certain things that we have the power to do, and this is one of the things that we can do. And I know for me, with this session, I'm 110% committed to neighborhood stabilization, because I know that it will go hand in hand with the crime. And then in turn, we can deal with the other issues that are affecting our neighborhood. Just being able to allow your children to go outside and play in a safe neighborhood. There's neighborhoods now that doesn't happen. Kids are being hit by stray bullets in these problem neighborhoods. And Councilmember Fields can attest, because she walks the streets in her neighborhood. And right now, I can honestly say that we are making an impact. We have acquired some of these vacant properties through the land bank. We're redeveloping them, we're repurposing them. You're going to see a difference in the upcoming years, in the upcoming months, on the east side and the lower hilltop. I can attest to that. Councilmember Fields can attest to that.
And we have affordable housing.
And we have affordable housing. We're dealing with a housing issue. So, you know, I know that things aren't always going to be perfect, and people fear this change, but at the end of the day, we have to make changes, and we have to get a handle. And the bureaucracy and the red tape of government has to stop. At some point, we just got to move forward with an action plan and make it happen. And we've been so blessed to get the ARPA funding, unfortunately through a catastrophe that hit our nation, but we've gotten it. And with that, we're able to make an impact and a difference. And I hope that we can get the buy-in of the community and the people who can invest in our city, but it's got to start with us, the council members. So with that said, now I will entertain a motion to move this ordinance, which is ordinance to amend Chapter 4 of the City Code to impose civil fines on owners of vacant properties, to move that to our the council meeting in February. May I get a motion?
So moved.
Second.
It has been properly moved in second. All in favor, reply with aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Hearing none, this will be before council in the second, in our council meeting in February. Are there any last closing comments that any of my council members would like to make?
I would,
Yes,
I
Councilmember
would
Fields?
just like to say, I really appreciate everyone's comments, geared towards what we're, talking about when it comes to community development and urban planning. It makes a big difference in our city, of Wilmington, so if we're all working together, to stabilize our, city, I can see it growing from what it used to be to where we can go further in the future. So these dialogues and these conversations are also beneficial, not just for us as council members, but also for the community to hear exactly how we're working things out, for betterment for them, for our stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'm just going to add one last comment, because what does the city do? We're not in the business of development. So we have a nonprofit that we work with, and that's the Wilmington Land Bank. So when the city does acquire the properties that nobody wants, we either, as we talked about, we're going to demolish them because they're beyond fixing. Some of them become side lots, what we really don't want to develop, because now you're getting some green spaces in the community. The other thing the Wilmington Land Bank is doing, they're putting these properties out to bid. So not only are we fixing our neighborhoods, but now we're giving small businesses, small contractors, 85% of them are minority contractors that are putting these bids. And we're not taking the highest bid on the Wilmington Land Bank. We're taking the best proposal that fits with the
Hey,
neighborhood.
you want to ride out somewhere for dinner?
And with that done, oh, somebody's going out to
Right, I'm in
dinner.
the car.
Oh, with Marshall, dinner. With that said, we're making an impact, so I want people to keep an eye out for the report that's coming out of all the properties that the Wilmington Land Bank has been able to repurpose, to sell. These contractors are doing excellent work. They're not doing cheap work, excellent work. They're selling the properties or they're renting them. So right now, we're teaching a man to fish, you know? We are actually developing our small businesses as well as our neighborhoods. And with that said, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. All in
Thank you.
favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Anyone want to stay here and talk some more?
Nope.
Okay. The meeting has been adjourned. Thank you for joining us.